The camp was silent except for music. A phonograph crackled somewhere beyond the fence. Something fast, something alive. The German women stopped their work. They'd heard American music before, plenty of times, but this was different. Through the barbed wire, they could see the clearing. Soldiers and women, American women, not standing apart, not watching from the edges, dancing, moving together like it was normal. Natural, their arms linked, heads tilted close, laughing. One guard didn't stop them from looking. He was young, maybe 19, and he was watching too, not to guard, but to understand. The older woman whispered in German. They'd been raised on warnings about Western decadence, about women who'd lost their honor. But there was no shame in their faces. No surrender, just joy. Simple, uncomplicated joy. And for a moment, everything they'd been told about defeat looked different. Wonder the factory whistle cut through darkness at 5 o'clock. Margaret heard it from her bed, a wail that meant the day had begun without asking. 34 years old, and the mirror showed only her hands. Raw, cracked, stained from the dye vats at Krupp. She dressed in the cold. The house is always cold now. In the kitchen, Liesel sat with a cup of something called coffee. Her daughter was 16 and already belonged to something larger than herself. The Hitler Youth Manual lay open on the table. The woman's body is designed for motherhood and service, Liesel read aloud, her voice carrying the certainty of doctrine. It is her glory and her duty. Margaret nodded while pouring water over bread to soften it. These words had shaped Liesel since childhood. They'd shaped all of them. The factory floor was a cathedral of noise. 200 women bent over machines that demanded constant feeding. Hilda worked beside Margaret, a widow with the martyred expression the party admired. The Americans have corrupted their women, Hilda said over the machine's roar. They let them work in offices, make decisions. Some don't marry at all. They smoke like men, wear trousers. She spat the last word like a curse. No order, no structure. Women become things. The other women murmured agreement. Margaret had learned the difference between agreement and performance. She stayed silent. At lunch in the windowless room, a young girl opened a photograph. Soldiers in snow. Her brothers, probably. Their eyes were empty. She stared while eating turnip soup without tasting it. No one asked what they were doing in Poland. Everyone knew. Everyone pretended not to know. In the evening, Margaret found a pamphlet about an American film. Photographs showed women, immodest, smiling with abandon, their bodies on display. The text warned how Americans weaponized their women to corrupt German soldiers. She read it carefully, as women had learned to read everything, as instruction, as truth. But late at night, alone, she wondered what it felt. Like to move without permission, to laugh loudly, to choose for yourself. These thoughts terrified her. They were treasonous. Then spring came and everything inverted. The Americans arrived from the east. No warnings, or warnings too late. The town was overrun in hours. Margaret and Liesel huddled in the cellar while the house shook. When they emerged, swastika banners were torn down. The Hitler Youth were just children again. An American soldier asked questions. By evening, Margaret was in a truck with 40 other women. Some are angry. Some were terrified. Some strangely relieved that maintaining the fiction was finally over. The truck rolled through darkness, and Germany disappeared behind her. The certainties she'd built her life on, the rules so complete they felt like breathing, were being taken away. She was a prisoner now, an enemy. When the truck stopped at the camp, there was barbed wire. American guards, no path forward that looked like anything she'd been taught to expect. She stepped down into the unknown, and everything she'd believed went quiet. The barracks smelled like wood and sweat and something else. Absence. Margaret stood in the doorway, holding a thin mattress and a blanket that felt like canvas. Around her, women were being assigned bunks by a soldier who spoke no German and seemed to care about nothing except the orderliness of rows. There was no shouting, no hits, just here, here, here. Efficient, almost bored. She'd expected horror. She'd prepared herself for it on the truck ride, stealing her mind the way women learn to do. But horror requires passion. What she found instead was indifference. The barracks held 60 women in a structure meant for 30. They slept in tiers, bodies pressed close enough to feel each other breathe. The American guards patrolled the perimeter with rifles but never entered unless necessary. At night, they didn't watch. They simply existed on the other side of the wire, distant and professional. Then there was Frau Becker. She'd been a head mistress before the war, a woman with a face like carved stone and iron-gray hair, pulled so tight it seemed to hurt. On the first morning, without being asked, she divided the women into work details. She appointed herself the liaison between the prisoners and the guards. She moved through the barracks checking for disorder, correcting posture, reminding them in sharp German that they were still German women, that discipline was their only dignity now. "We will not become like them," she announced at the evening assembly, her voice carrying across the barracks. "We will maintain order, standards, identity." The younger women listened. Some nodded. Some stared at the floor. Frau Becker's version of order was the only structure they could still hold on to. But there was Anna, thin, with eyes that had already given up. She was a widow. Her husband had died in Africa 2 years ago, her son in France last year. When Frau Becker wasn't looking, Anna would sit quietly and sometimes smile at nothing. It was this smile that terrified Frau Becker most. It suggested surrender. And then there was Liesel's age, a girl named Sophie who asked questions. Why did the guards have Coca-Cola? Where did the food come from? One afternoon she asked an American guard in broken English where he was from. The guard, a boy no older than 25, answered, "Minnesota." He showed her a photograph of a farm. Sophie listened as if he was reading scripture. The food arrived at 6 in the morning. Thin soup, a piece of bread, sometimes, impossibly, an apple. It was distributed by the guards themselves, portion by portion, identical. No favoritism, no theft, just enough to survive, never enough to forget hunger. This fairness was disorienting. Margaret watched a woman try to understand it. The woman, Hilda, from the factory, stood at the food line expecting to give something, to perform servility, to earn what she received. But the guard simply handed her a bowl. No transaction meant no hierarchy, no clear way to exist. "It's a trick," Hilda whispered to Margaret. "They're weakening us with this kindness." But Margaret wasn't sure. The guards seemed genuinely unconcerned with cruelty. One afternoon, a woman collapsed during work. A guard helped her to the infirmary. No punishment, just, she was sick, so she was moved. It was rational, merciful even. But mercy required intention, and these Americans seemed to have none. They were simply administering a camp the way one maintains a machine. At night, lying on the thin mattress, Margaret listened to the sounds of 40 women breathing in the dark. Above her, someone wept silently. Below her, someone else snored. Frau Becker patrolled like a ghost, ensuring order even in sleep. The wire hummed in the wind. Margaret had been taught that captivity would break her. But no one here was breaking anything. They were just waiting. And waiting, she was beginning to understand, might be harder than pain. It started with a photograph. The young guard, his name was Jack, though the women only knew this from hearing the others call him, was sitting on a bench during the lunch hour, looking at a small picture. Sophie passed nearby, pretending to gather wood. She saw it, a woman in military uniform, dark hair, standing in front of an airplane. Jack looked at the photograph the way a man looks at a holy object. Reverent. Proud. By evening, the story had traveled through the barracks like electricity. "His sister," Hilda whispered, her voice tight. "She wears a uniform." "But not to marry," another woman added. "To fly. To fly the planes." Frau Becker, who was mending a sock nearby, didn't look up, but her jaw tightened. "Propaganda," she said flatly. "They show us lies to weaken our resolve." But it was hard to call it propaganda when the guard himself had shown the photograph without ceremony. He hadn't been trying to deceive. He'd simply been proud. The stories multiplied. A guard mentioned his fiancée worked as a nurse, not at a hospital where women belonged, but at the front. Another guard, older, spoke about his mother, a teacher who'd published books. Books with her name on them, as if she were a man. Sophie sat close during these conversations, her eyes wide. She was 18 and had spent her entire conscious life inside a rigid world, and now the edges of that world were beginning to blur. "They're not destroyed," she said one night, her voice barely audible in the darkness. "The American women, they're not ruined." "Keep your voice down," Frau Becker hissed from across the barracks. "That's exactly what they want you to think." But the damage was done. The seed was planted. Margaret found herself listening more carefully now. There was a guard, older, perhaps 40, who sometimes supervised the laundry detail. One afternoon, he mentioned his wife, not as a possession, not as a duty, but as a person he'd chosen, a person with opinions. "She argued with me about politics," he said, almost laughing. "Said I was wrong about something. We argued, and then we agreed, and then we made dinner together." Anna, the widow, looked at Margaret across the folded sheets. In her eyes was something that might have been recognition. That night, the barracks fractured into quiet debate. "The photographs are faked," Hilda insisted. "American deception. We know this from the pamphlets." "But the guards seem proud," Sophie said carefully. "Not ashamed? If it was scandalous, wouldn't they hide it? Or they're so corrupted they don't understand shame anymore," offered another woman, Gerda, who still wore her Nazi loyalty like armor. Margaret listened without speaking. She thought of Liesel, somewhere outside the wire. She thought of the version of womanhood she'd passed to her daughter, obedience, purpose through service, meaning found only in duty. She thought of the young American woman flying an airplane. What if the propaganda had lied about more than just one thing? The thought was dangerous, unforgivable, but it wouldn't leave. Frau Becker moved through the barracks more rigidly now, sensing the erosion of certainty. She increased the routines, tightened discipline, and gripped harder. But her grip was slipping. The women could feel it. Outside the wire, the guards laughed about their lives, their sisters, their mothers, their fiancés who spoke back. Ordinary conversations that carried the weight of an impossible world. And the women listened, hungry, frightened, beginning to ask questions they'd been taught never to ask. What if? What if? What if? The notice was typed on a single sheet of paper, posted on the barracks door the morning it happened. A festival? Summer. Music and dancing. The German women were permitted to watch from the designated area. No closer, no interference, a gesture of normalcy, a reward for compliance. Most of them said nothing when they read it. That night, the barracks became a different place. Not louder, but alive with a kind of quiet electricity. Women moved with purpose. Anna pulled out a dress she hadn't worn since arrival. A simple thing, blue with white trim. She held it to the light from the window, checking for stains, for tears, for any sign of degradation. She'd been broken for so long that caring about how her dress looked felt like betrayal. But she cared anyway. Sophie borrowed a mirror shard from Gerda, a dangerous transaction, given that Frau Becker had forbidden such vanities. Gerda pressed it into her hand anyway, a small rebellion neither of them acknowledged. Sophie held it up and looked at herself for the first time in months. Her face was thinner. Her hair had lost its shine, but she still existed in there somewhere. The mirror proved it. Hilda sat on her bunk and pressed the wrinkles from her dress using the edge of a hot pan from the kitchen. The steam rose into her face, and she closed her eyes, breathing it in like it was perfume. Around her, other women watched without comment. They understood. Margaret found herself washing her hands and arms with extra care, using precious water. She didn't examine why. She simply did it, the way one performs a ritual without knowing its meaning. Frau Becker moved through the barracks, her face set in disapproval. "This is not about vanity," she announced, though no one had argued with her. "We will observe the American display with the dignity of German women. We will not be corrupted by it." But her voice was thin. She knew what was happening. By evening, the barracks hummed with nervous energy. Women checked their hair multiple times. One woman pinched her cheeks to bring color to them. Another asked if anyone had heard what kind of music the Americans played. Fast or slow? Happy or sad? No one answered, because no one knew. The uncertainty itself was intoxicating. Sophie sat with Margaret as darkness fell. "Do you think it will be—" Sophie paused, searching for the word. "Sinful." Margaret didn't answer immediately. She thought of the pamphlets, the warnings, the photographs of American women with their arms linked through men's arms, their bodies close, their faces flushed. She thought of Hilda calling it corruption. She thought of the guard showing a photograph of his sister, his face full of pride. "I don't know," Margaret said finally. "Maybe we'll understand better tomorrow." The night was restless. Women slept and woke and slept again. At dawn, they dressed with the kind of attention usually reserved for Easter or Christmas. Holidays that felt like a different world now. By the time the guards called them out, they were ready. More than ready. Hungry. They were led to a clearing near the American barracks, a distance of perhaps 50 meters. There was a roped-off area where the women prisoners were to stand. Beyond it, the camp was being transformed. Strings of lights hung between trees. A phonograph was being set up. A few tables with refreshments. American soldiers were already gathering, still in uniform but with an ease in their shoulders that suggested the war had become abstract for them. Then the music started, and everything changed. The phonograph crackled, a trumpet wailed, then a rhythm that pulled at something primitive in the chest. The first soldiers who moved to the clearing were tentative, still soldiers even in joy. But then the American women arrived, not from the camp, but from town. They wore summer dresses. Their hair was down. They moved like people who'd forgotten how to be afraid. The German women watched with the detachment of the condemned observing the living. Soldiers took the hands of these women. They began to move together. It was called dancing, but it wasn't the formal, prescribed movement the German women knew. There was space between the bodies, but it was a chosen space, intimate without being obscene. Then she appeared. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and a simple yellow dress. Nothing special, nothing decorated. Just a woman. A soldier pulled her close, his hand at her waist, and she turned to face him, and for a moment, there was nothing in the world but the two of them. They danced, but it wasn't only dancing. Her forehead tilted toward his, her eyes closed. His hand drew her closer, and she let it, and she smiled. Not the practiced smile of duty, not the grimace of obligation. A real smile, a smile that said, "I'm choosing this. I'm here because I want to be here. With you." The German woman stopped breathing. Margaret felt something in her chest crack open. She'd been married. She'd known what a husband's hand felt like. But it had never looked like this. It had never been a conversation. It had never been a choice. Anna made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a cry. Her hand went to her mouth. Frau Becker stood rigid, her eyes fixed on the couple. Her lips moved silently. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Gott im Himmel. God in heaven. It wasn't a curse. It was a prayer of confusion, a prayer asking God to explain what she was seeing. Sophie's eyes were wet. She didn't wipe them. She simply stared. Hilda whispered, There's no ownership. That was the word. That was the truth they were all recognizing. The American woman wasn't performing for her partner. She wasn't giving him something. She was simply being with him. Equal, present, free. More couples moved to the clearing. Some danced fast, with energy and laughter. Some danced slowly, the women's heads against the soldiers' shoulders, their bodies moving as one. The German women watched each one like it was a revelation. One older German woman, Margaret didn't know her name, whispered something in the rhythm of prayer. Vergib mir. Forgive me. Forgive me for what I taught my daughter. Forgive me for the lies I believed. The music continued. The dancing continued, and the German women stood behind the rope, behind the wire, watching a version of womanhood they'd been told didn't exist. Watching freedom, watching joy, watching mutual respect move across a clearing like something so ordinary, so natural, that no one had to explain it. Margaret realized she was trembling. It wasn't disgusting. It wasn't a scandal. It was recognition. Recognition of everything she'd been denied, everything Liesel had been denied, everything the world had tried to convince her was impossible. The music swelled. The soldiers and the American women kept dancing, oblivious to the revolution happening behind the rope, the silent, irreversible crumbling of a certainty that had shaped 3 decades of German womanhood. The barracks door closed, and the women fractured into separate universes. Frau Becker stood in the center of the room, her face flushed, her movements sharp and precise. That, she announced, her voice cutting across the darkness, was obscenity. Women throw themselves at men like animals. No restraint. No dignity. No... She searched for the word, finding it like a weapon. No honor. She began to recite. Not just ideology, but the specific doctrines they'd memorized as girls. The natural hierarchy, the woman's sacred duty, the corruption of the West. Her words were a barrier, a wall she was rebuilding brick by brick, faster and faster, as if sheer volume could undo what they'd witnessed. But her voice was thinner than it had been that morning. Sophie sat on her bunk and said nothing. She was quiet in a way that was different from before, thoughtful. Her eyes were unfocused, seeing something internal. In that dance, she'd seen something that spoke to a part of herself that had survived the war intact, a part she'd thought was dead, a part that wanted to move, to laugh, to be near someone without asking permission first. Anna lay on her mattress, and for the first time in years, she seemed at peace. Her widow's grief had become a kind of armor, and now that armor was dissolving. She'd already lost everything. The world had already taken her husband, her children's future, her youth. If the old rules were false, then she was free. The liberation was terrible and absolute. She smiled in the darkness. Not a happy smile. A smile that acknowledged the joke. She'd had to lose everything to become free. Hilda was restless. She moved from bunk to bunk, her agitation visible. "Did you see the way she looked at him?" she said. "Did you see how she—" She gestured, imitating the closeness, the foreheads nearly touching. It was shameless. It was exactly what they warned us about. But the other women weren't listening with the agreement she needed. Their silence was fractured. Margaret stood by the window, looking out at the wire and the darkness beyond. Next to her was Ursula, an older woman, perhaps 60, whose face had been carved by loss. Ursula's husband had died in the First War. She'd raised 3 sons through peace and into the Second War. All 3 are gone now. I could have laughed like that, Ursula said quietly. Her voice wasn't angry yet, but underneath it was something building. When I was young, before I learned not to, my husband would have liked it. Instead, I learned to be quiet, obedient, grateful. She turned to Margareta. And now he's dead, and I never laughed like that even once. The anger was arriving now, not hot, but cold and complete. It's a waste, Ursula continued. All of it. The years we spent teaching ourselves to be small when we could have. She couldn't finish. The sentence was too large to hold. Gerda, the younger Hitler Youth adherent, listened from her bunk. She tried to maintain the ideology, but Margareta could see her hands trembling. She was fighting something internal. The battle was visible on her face. By midnight, the barracks had become a collection of private rooms. Women turned to the walls. Some wept silently. Some lay awake with their eyes open. Some, like Anna, seemed to have entered a state of quiet revelation. The divisions were sharp now. Not all of them could accept what they'd seen. Some would defend the old world to the end, because the alternative, admitting they'd been lied to, that they'd wasted their lives, was unbearable. But others had begun to grieve. They grieved the lives they might have lived, the daughters they might have raised differently, the laughter they might have allowed themselves, the world that could have existed if history had written a different story. In the darkness, 40 women lay in separate silences, each one containing a different truth, and none of them quite sure how to live with what they now knew. The work detail was moving rubble from the old fence line. 3 days of labor in the heat, carrying wood and stone from one place to another and then back again. The kind of work that kept the mind empty. Sophie was grateful for the emptiness. Since the dancing, her mind had been too full. Jack was assigned to watch them, the young guard, the one with the sister who flew planes. Sophie didn't plan to speak to him. She knew better, but as she passed with an arm full of stones, something, hunger or courage, or the simple accumulation of questions she couldn't ask anyone in the barracks, made her stop. "Excuse," she said in English. The word came out uncertain, almost a question. Jack looked at her, not suspicious, not unkind, just a present. "The woman," Sophie continued, the words coming slowly. "Yellow dress. Dancing. Who is she?" Jack could have turned away. He should have. Instead, he set down his rifle, a small gesture that meant he was choosing connection over protocol. He studied Sophie for a moment, perhaps recognizing something in her, perhaps simply deciding to be human. "Her name is Margaret," he said. "She's a nurse. Works at the hospital in town." "Married?" Sophie asked. "No." Sophie absorbed this. A woman, unmarried, working without shame, moving through the world with autonomy. The concept still felt impossible, even with proof standing in front of her. "She dances because she likes to," Jack continued, as if reading the next question in her silence. "She chooses to dance. No one tells her she can't. No one owns her choices." The words hung between them. Owner. Choice. Two concepts that had never existed simultaneously in Sophie's world. "In my country," Jack said, his voice becoming quieter. "Not everyone is the way your leaders said. My mother, she's a teacher. She reads books, she writes, she speaks her mind about things. Sometimes my father disagrees with her. Sometimes she disagrees with him. And then we eat dinner together anyway." Sophie tried to imagine this. An argument that didn't end in submission. Disagreement that didn't destroy. Two people choosing each other after disagreeing. "They don't say you're bad?" she asked. "Bad?" Jack almost smiled. "No. She's the smartest person I know. My father tells people that. He's proud." Margaret had moved closer, pretending to work. She heard every word. Jack picked up his rifle again, a small return to protocol, to the distance between them that had to exist. But something had changed. The distance had been bridged, if only for a moment. "Your mother," Sophie said carefully. "She's happy." Jack looked at her. Really looked at her. And he nodded. "Very happy." Sophie turned back to her work. She carried the stones, but something was different now. She'd heard testimony. She'd heard a guard, an American, the enemy, speak about his mother the way Margaret had never heard any woman spoken of in Germany. As a person, as a presence, as someone whose thoughts mattered. That night in the barracks, Sophie whispered the conversation to the women around her. Word by word, she repeated Jack's mother's existence like it was scripture, and in the darkness, women who'd been trained their entire lives to believe one thing about the world began to wonder if they'd been lied to about something even deeper. Not just about women, but about what women could be, what they could have, what they deserved. One sentence, "She's the smartest person I know," traveled through the barracks like a virus. By morning, it had transformed into something larger than words. It had become proof that another world was possible, that other men existed who could recognize a woman's mind, that other lives were being lived in ways they'd never been told. The guard had given them more than information. He'd given them hope, and hope, in a prison, is the most dangerous and necessary thing. 3 days after the dancing, the barracks fell into a different kind of silence. Not the quiet of obedience, but the silence of women alone, with their thoughts. The kind of silence that precedes something breaking. Hilda was the first to crack. She sat on her bunk, her jaw tight, her fingers working a piece of thread over and over. "If they lied about that," she said to no one and everyone, "what else did they lie about?" The question hung in the air like poison gas. Frau Becker moved immediately. She'd been waiting for this moment and had felt it coming like a storm. "We will not engage in this kind of thinking," she announced, her voice cutting across the barracks. "This is how corruption spreads. Through doubt, through questions. We maintain discipline, we maintain German honor. That is all that remains to us." But her voice was thinner than it had been. They all heard it. Margaret watched a woman named Ursula, a mother she'd mentioned once of 3 sons, stare at the wall. The woman's hands were folded in her lap, perfectly still. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I told them to be strong," Ursula said. "My daughters. I told them that obedience was strength. Those questions were weak, that a woman's power came from serving silently." She paused. Her hands began to tremble. "They're dead. All of them. My sons. And I spent my daughters' entire childhoods teaching them to be small so they would survive. But there was nothing to survive for." She wept then. Not quietly, but with the full, broken sound of someone whose entire life had collapsed into meaninglessness. Around her, women looked away. Her grief was too honest, too dangerous. Anna stood and walked to where Ursula sat. She placed a hand on her shoulder and said nothing. There was nothing to say. They had all spent their lives making choices they'd been taught were right, and now those choices looked like graves. But Anna herself felt something different. She was a widow. Her husband was gone, her children grown. The rules that had bound her, obedience, service, the performance of grief, were suddenly optional. If those rules were lies, then she was already free. There was a strange, terrible liberation in that realization. She found herself walking differently, standing differently, speaking without waiting for permission from Frau Becker's gaze. Over the following days, factions hardened. The older, rigid women, Frau Becker, Gerda, a few others, held even tighter to the old ideology. They cited honor, duty, the need to maintain structure, but their grip was weakening. Younger women began to resist, not openly, not dramatically, but through small refusals. A woman would ask to do a different work assignment. Another would sit quietly during one of Frau Becker's assemblies instead of standing at attention. Sophie spent hours imagining. What if no one had ever told her that freedom was corruption? What if she'd been taught that her mind mattered, that her choices mattered? She was 18. How many years had she wasted already, bending herself into smaller and smaller shapes to fit the world she'd been given? The imagining itself was a rebellion. Margaret moved between these worlds. She was too old for Sophie's fierce questioning, too young for Frau Becker's desperate certainty. She thought of Liesel constantly now. She thought of the years she'd spent teaching her daughter to diminish herself, teaching her that a woman's worth came from service, teaching her that desire was dangerous. What if, she thought, Liesel didn't have to become her? The weight of that question was almost unbearable. One night, Ursula lay in her bunk and whispered an apology to daughters who couldn't hear her. Anna lay below her, eyes open, aware that she had time left, years, perhaps, and for the first time in her life, she could choose what to do with that time. Frau Becker patrolled the darkened barracks, sensing the loss of authority, trying to reassert control through sheer force of will. But her will was no match for the force moving through the women now. It had no name yet. It didn't need one. It was the simple, irreversible recognition that they'd been wrong, that everything they'd built their lives on was questionable, that another world, not an American world, but simply another world, was possible. And once you knew that, you could never know it. Margaret wrote the first letter. It took her 3 days to find the courage. She stood at the supply office, a small wooden structure where the guards dispensed paper for official documents, and asked if she could write to her daughter. The guard, a man with tired eyes, didn't ask why. He simply handed her a sheet of paper and a pencil. She held them like they might burn her. What could she say? That she'd been wrong? That everything she'd taught Liesel was built on lies? That there was another way to be a woman, not corrupt, not shameful, but simply free? She couldn't write that. The letter would be read. Censored. Dangerous. So she wrote small things, that she was well, that she hoped Liesel was safe, that she wanted Liesel to think for herself. That last line was all of it, everything she couldn't say. Think for yourself. Other women noticed. By the end of the week, 3 more had asked to write. Hilda didn't. Hilda maintained her rigid posture, her criticism of the women who were falling apart. But Gerda did. Anna did. And Sophie, who asked permission in halting English to listen to American music on the phonograph. The guard almost laughed. He set her down in front of the phonograph one evening, and the needle dropped into the groove. Jazz poured out like something alive. It didn't have the order of German music. It didn't march. It didn't ascend toward something heroic. It twisted and turned and seemed to argue with itself. And somehow, in that argument, it was more honest than anything Sophie had heard in years. She sat very still. Around her, women paused in their evening routines. They could hear it too. Freedom, the refusal to follow a predetermined path. The music said, there are many ways to move, many ways to be. When it finished, Sophie was crying. Then came the books. Anna requested one first, a novel by an American author. The guard brought it 3 days later, its spine cracked, its pages worn from other hands. Anna opened it and found herself on the first page. The narrator was a woman thinking about her own life, her own desires, her own mind. She read until the lights went out. The next morning, she read before breakfast. By the 3rd day, she'd finished it, and she pressed it into Margaret's hands like it was contraband. This woman, Anna whispered. She leaves. She chooses a different life. And it's not a sin. It's just her life. Margaret read it in fragments, in stolen moments. The protagonist made mistakes. She was flawed. And yet she was allowed to exist on the page as a full person, not a symbol, not a duty, not a function. Other books followed. A woman requested poetry. Another asked for anything about science. The camp, remarkably, accommodated these requests. Perhaps the commander understood that small freedoms prevented larger rebellions. Perhaps he simply believed that minds deserved nourishment. In the evenings, the barracks transformed into something it had never been. Women read aloud to each other. They discussed what they'd read. Arguments emerged. Gentle, thoughtful arguments about whether the American author was right, whether the character should have made a different choice. These arguments felt revolutionary because they centered on ideas, not obedience. Frau Becker's authority had become almost ceremonial now. She still moved through the barracks, still demanded order, but the women were elsewhere. Mentally, spiritually, emotionally elsewhere. One night, Margaret sat on her bunk holding the American novel, and she wept quietly. Not for herself, it was too late for her, but for Liesel. For all the versions of Liesel that would never exist because of choices made before Liesel was born. For the girl who might have read this book at 20 and recognized herself. For the life Liesel might have lived if the world had been different. These small acts of resistance, the letters, the music, the books, felt revolutionary. But they were also funerals. Quiet grieving for the women they might have been. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. The women prisoners would be repatriated. It was spoken matter-of-factly by the camp commander, as if it were no more significant than a change in the work schedule. But the words carried the weight of an entire world collapsing and reforming simultaneously. Margaret sat on her bunk and felt nothing at first. Then everything. Home. She would see Liesel. She would sleep in her own bed. She would return to a Germany that no longer existed, or rather, a Germany that had existed and could never exist again, not in the way she'd known it. The country she was going home to would be divided, ashamed, and rebuilt from rubble. But she was no longer the woman who'd left it. That was the problem. In the days before departure, the barracks fractured into different futures. Hilda packed her things and said she would tell no one what she'd seen. "It will only cause confusion," she announced. "People need certainty. They need order. What good does it do to tell them the world is different?" She would go home and rebuild the old structure, brick by brick, lie by lie, hoping the architecture would hold. Some women nodded. They understood the appeal of that erasure. But Anna took Margaret's hand the morning of departure. "I'm going to tell them," she said quietly. "My daughter, my granddaughter. I'm going to tell them there's another way." Her voice was steady. She'd already grieved everything she'd lost. Now she would plant seeds. Sophie asked if she could take the American novel with her. The guard hesitated, then allowed it. A small rebellion. A woman would return to Germany carrying proof that another world existed, pressed between worn pages. Then, 3 days before transport, a letter arrived for one of the women. It was addressed in careful handwriting to someone named Greta, a woman none of them had paid particular attention to. Greta, who'd stood at the edge of groups, who'd watched the dancing with an expression that shifted between hunger and terror. Greta, who'd never asked for anything. The letter was from Margaret, the American woman in the yellow dress. Greta opened it with shaking hands. The room fell silent. She read it, and her eyes moved across the page once, twice, 3 times, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. "She wants to write to me," Greta whispered. "She says..." Her voice broke. "She says she saw me watching. She says it was important. She says she hopes we can be friends." The letter was simple, kind. It asked nothing of Greta, except that she remembered. Remember that there were women who danced freely. Remember that freedom existed. Remember that across an impossible divide, one woman had reached out and said, "You matter. Your thoughts matter. I see you." Margaret watched Greta fold the letter carefully, reverently, and tuck it into her dress. Greta would carry it her entire life. She would pull it out in moments of doubt. She would read it to her children. She would say, "An American woman wrote this to me." She didn't have to, but she did. The transport truck arrived at dawn. The women climbed in, each carrying whatever they'd accumulated: a book, a letter, a photograph, the ghost of permission to be fully human. They were no longer prisoners, but they were no longer the women who'd arrived either. Germany rose up to meet them, grey and broken and trying to forget. The old hierarchies would attempt to reassert themselves. Some women would be silent, some would plant seeds, some would carry letters across decades. But none of them could know what they'd learned. None of them could believe again in the old order with the same completeness. A revolution had happened. It was quiet. It was small. It moved through families like whispered stories, like books passed hand to hand, like letters preserved in drawers. One American woman had danced. Other women had watched. And in that watching, a world of certainty had cracked open, never to fully close again. Some revolutions make headlines. Some move through the private lives of ordinary women, changing not governments, but hearts, changing not laws, but the stories mothers tell their daughters. Margaret stepped down from the truck into a Germany that was waiting to tell her who to be. But she already knew. She was a woman who'd seen freedom. She was a woman who'd been shown another way, and that knowledge, once planted, could never be fully uprooted. It would have to be enough. And in the end, it was.